Hello, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy, and our topic for tonight is it's Scott Ritter night. Recently, Scott put forward two pieces on his substack that I thought were outstanding, and I wanted to go over them with you. Uh, I'm going to start with the first one. Hey, Steve Wolfbrandt, great to see you here. Thank you for coming. The first one from Scott is entitled There Can Be No Freedom Without Free Speech. And it was published about a week ago on August 22nd, 2024. I've been saving it for a good time. If you're talking about free speech and the importance of it, I think any time is a good time, but especially this time. This is Freedom of Speech by Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell painting. Almost looks like a Jimmy Stewart standing up there doing free speech. That is somebody with big ears, anyway. Scott begins. The Department of Justice has launched a broad investigation which implicates the First Amendment free speech rights of not only those Americans such as me caught up in this web, but all Americans. Because if the government succeeds in silencing free speech through what's unlawful application of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, it won't stop until it silences all dissenting voices in America. I happen to agree with that sentiment, but I'm also against just the attempts to silence free speech by pressuring, I won't call them free speech platforms, but they are speech platforms, and the government has been influencing the owners of the private platforms to silence people speaking on those platforms. Now, that might not be a case of the government passing any law, or making any law, but it still seems like it ought to be a violation of the Constitution to me, since the government is placing pressure and threatening loss of business, either implicitly or explicitly, against those who have platforms being used by people to express themselves. Platforms such as Facebook, for example. Just a few days ago, Mark Zuckerberg, said that he was sorry he accepted the pressure of the government in suppressing speech on his Facebook and Meta platforms when it came to COVID. He did this at the request of the government, and right now he's sorry he did it, because the truth about COVID and how to treat it, what to do about it, was severely constrained in coming out through the kind of influence the government was exerting on him. Scott goes on. I've written about the FBI's August 7th raid on my home. I've written about the collateral consequences of this raid. I've written about my relationship with RT, which is Russia Today, of course, that appears to be at the center of the concerns expressed by the FBI agents carrying out the raid. At that time, I noted the FBI was unable or unwilling to articulate specific allegations linked to their statements that the search was related to concerns regarding my activities as they relate to the Foreign Agent Registration Act, or FARA. I wrote a letter to the Chief of the Department of Justice's FARA Enforcement Unit requesting they provide me with the evidence that underpinned their concerns so that I might be able to evaluate them and respond. To date, I have heard nothing in return. We now have an update, so to speak. The New York Times has published an article jointly authored by Stephen Lee Myers and Julian Barnes titled, quote, U.S. investigating Americans who worked with Russia state television, unquote. I am named, along with Dmitry Simes, as the initial target of this investigation, which is described by the Times as, quote, a broad criminal investigation, unquote, intended to, quote, combat the Kremlin's influence operation leading up to the presidential election in November, unquote. According to the Times, quote, more searches are expected soon, unquote. The predicate for this investigation, says Scott, appears to be a July 29th, quote, election security update published by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, which warns of actions undertaken by, quote, foreign actors, unquote, to conduct, quote, influence operations targeting U.S. elections this November, unquote. ODNI accuses Russia of, quote, leveraging Russia-based influence for hire firms, unquote, to, quote again, create influence platforms, unquote, which, quote, yet again, directly and discreetly, unquote, engage Americans to, quote, to tailor content for U.S. audiences while hiding Russia's hand, unquote. Russia, along with China and Iran, is accused of relying upon, quote, witting and unwitting Americans to seed, promote, and add credibility to narratives, unquote, that serve Russian interests. Russia is specifically accused of using, quote, networks of U.S. and other Western personalities to create and disseminate Russian-friendly narratives. These personalities post content on social media, write for various websites with overt and covert ties to the Russian governments, and conduct other media efforts, unquote. Okay. I have to add here to what Scott is saying. That when Russia is accused of relying on witting and unwitting Americans, is it a crime? I don't even know what it means to say that Russia relies on unwitting Americans. If the Americans are unwitting and have no contact, okay, with Russia, and are seeding, promoting, and adding credibility to narratives that are serving Russian interests, Uh, I don't understand why there's something wrong with it, since we have guarantees of free speech, in this country. If the Americans involved, are unwitting, and yet what they're doing with their narratives is telling the truth, then does the government have the right to oppose narratives coming from Americans exercising their rights, of free speech, if all those Americans are telling the truth as they see it? In other words, if the truth happens to serve the interests, of Russia, are the American people to be barred from saying the truth? Why isn't truth a defense in these instances? And let's say the Americans happen to be witting. In other words, let's say the Americans know that the truth they are telling as they see it may serve Russian interests. Should they be barred from telling the truth, which certainly the people of the United States have a right to know? Should they be barred from telling the truth just because they serve the interests of Russia? What about if these truths serve the interests of Russia, but also serve the interests of America in the opinion of the people telling these truths? Why should that be some kind of crime? Why should the government of the United States have the privilege of tampering with narratives that are the truth, or close to the truth, or closer to the truth than the American narratives which the government is purveying? We're a democracy, or supposed to be one, and democracies are supposed to rely on the truth, on people telling the truth to each other, and on making it possible for the people to know the truth so they can take action that is the right action in relation to their government and their politicians. It seems to me the government here is arrogating the right to itself to oppose narratives, to suppress narratives that it wants to suppress, regardless of the relation of those narratives to the truth. This is obnoxious to any democracy. Going further with Scott's article, Russia, quote unquote, the ODNI report states, quote, remains the predominant threat, to U.S. elections. Moscow continues to use a broad stable of influence, actors, and tactics, and is working to better hide its hand, enhance its reach, and create content that resonates more, with U.S. audiences. Well, certainly Russia and Israel, and the United Kingdom, and France, and Germany, and China, and Iran, and every foreign nation is trying to use content that it releases to resonate more with U.S. audiences, because these foreign states have a case to make. Now, they aren't supposed to tamper with U.S. politics in various ways. That's against, the law. But foreign nations, last time I looked, have the right to speak in defense of and for themselves. And people here in the United States have the right to hear their case, just in case what they have to say is closer to the truth of what is going on in international affairs than the narratives our own government happens to be putting forward. If we have an open society, which is something essential to democracy, then that society has to be open to other narratives, including foreign narratives. Now, foreign nations certainly shouldn't be allowed to pay people here in order to specifically express the views of the foreign nation states. But world opinion is a worldwide open market. And they certainly have the right, in the context of that market, to employ people who will make public their opinions and their views, on international relations. And in my view, there should be no foundational assumption that they're necessarily lying to themselves or the American people in the pronouncements that they make. We need to be allowed to evaluate what they have to say in the same way we evaluate what our government says. If not, if we don't have that right and the government tries to take away that right, then it's the government that would be manipulating our opinions and our thoughts back here. This cannot be allowed in an open society. In a democracy, it cannot be allowed. It's the people that need to be allowed, to determine what is true, and what is not true, what narratives are acceptable and what narratives are not acceptable. Going on. These actors are seeking to back a presidential candidate in addition to influencing congressional electoral outcomes, undermine public confidence in the electoral process, and exacerbate socio-political divisions. Now, that's an interesting statement by the ODNI, but I wonder how they know that. Some of the actors who have been putting narratives forth that do not agree with the narratives of the government are supporting different presidential candidates, among themselves. Some of them, of course, are supporters of Trump. But many of the actors are not supporters of Trump. Some may be Green Party supporters. Some may be Libertarian Party supporters. Some may be Democratic Party supporters. There is no monolithic situation here where there are actors that, because they hold particular views on foreign policy, mean that they're backing a particular presidential candidate. That's especially true in the current situation that we face here. Both of our presidential candidates are people who back wars and conflict. There's no particular reason why someone who recognizes the needs of the Palestinians, in Gaza, ought to be backing the Democratic presidential candidate as opposed to the Republican presidential candidate. So I don't know what the ODNI means here. I really don't. This is baloney. Maybe what the ODNI means is that anybody who puts forward a narrative that's different from the current narrative that the government is propounding is somehow speaking on behalf of the interests of a foreign power. If that's the idea behind what the ODNI is saying, that idea is totally false. Scott goes on, I was interviewed by Mr. Myers for this article, and the article accurately reflects my statements and position regarding this investigation, which I called, quote, a frontal assault on the Constitution of the United States, unquote. I have to agree with that. I believe that the search of Scott's home was a frontal assault on the Constitution of the United States. This article was about the First Amendment protection of rights to free speech. But of course, the rights of free press and the rights of free speech are both very much impacted here by this investigation. Scott has free press rights, as well, as he's a self-publisher on Substack. So these interferences by the government violate both his rights of free speech and his rights of free press. The Times article's authors note that the investigation, quote, could also bump up against the First Amendment's protection of rights to free speech, unquote. I disagree, Scott says. This investigation tramples over the First Amendment's free speech protections. Again, I believe Scott is right. The protections in the Bill of Rights, such as forbidding Congress from abridging free speech, not become part of the legal and social conscious conscience of America until the 20th century, when the Supreme Court began vigorously to use the Bill of Rights as the defining document of what constitutes liberty and equality in America. Regarding free speech, the Supreme Court has stated that, quote, as a general matter, the First Amendment means the government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content, unquote. Like any constitutional right, there is no absolute protection of free speech. However, the Supreme Court has tailored a narrowly defined exception of free speech known as the Gibbonet exception after a 1949 case by Gibbonet versus Empire Storage and Ice Company, which holds that First Amendment immunity does not extend to speech, quote, used as an integral part of conduct in violation of a valid criminal statute. The, quote, Gibbonet exception, unquote, however, cannot, quote, justify treating speech as integral to illegal conduct, quote, unquote, simply because the speech is illegal under the law that is being challenged, unquote. Scott says, I have not been formally charged with the crime. The FBI, however, when conducting the search of my home, indicated that the legal justification behind the search was concerns about my speech as it applied to Farah. This is a literal case of the Justice Department using a law, Farah, to criminalize free speech by making free speech illegal under the law. The ODNI threat assessment appears to be concerned about what can only be described as political speech. This is problematic in the extreme. There is no doubt that I am highly critical of the policies of the United States in instances where they clash with my strongly held positions on war and peace, arms control and disarmament, and the role of the United States in world affairs. Ever since the U.S. government fabricated the case for war to justify the March 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, I have spoken out publicly in opposition to policies which I believe promote unnecessary conflict and are disruptive to the cause of peace. In one example of this, I was invited by the Abu Dhabi-based Zayed Center for Coordination and Follow-Up, an Arab League think tank, funded by UAE Deputy Prime Minister Sheikh Sultan bin Zayed Al Nahyan, to give an address about the U.S. push for war with Iraq. But Prime Minister Sultan attended the lecture in person, quote, in a rare public appearance, unquote. A U.S. Embassy cable commenting on my presentation noted, excuse me a second, quote, addressing the diplomatic and press corps, unquote, a diplomatic cable noted, quote, Ritter predictably derided Secretary of State Colin Powell's, quote, smoke and mirrors presentation before the UN Security Council, noting that the U.S., bent on regime change, is determined to undermine the inspections process. By Ritter, unquote. The cable continued, quote, posited that as long as the U.S. is on regime change, the international community must remain suspicious of U.S. policy, and all Americans assigned to inspection teams in Iraq should be considered intelligence agents. He described the U.S. Iraq policy as being part of a grander design aimed at regional transformation, and took issue with what he characterized as our unilateralist approach. Ritter predicted a popular Iraqi uprising against the U.S. operation of Iraq, coupled with broader instability in the region, which could result in the downfall of some Arab governments, unquote. There's a picture of Colin Powell giving his, quote, smoke and mirrors, unquote, speech to the Security Council in February of 2003. If there ever was a poster child for the value of free speech by Americans in opposing U.S. foreign policy, my presentation in Abu Dhabi is it. In opposition to U.S. policy and the deceptions it was based upon, I correctly defined the heart of the failed policy, regime change versus disarmament, as well as the consequences of implementing it, a popular uprising against the U.S. occupiers, and the 2010 Arab Spring. I had been invited to Abu Dhabi by an institute funded and directed by a foreign government. I was paid, an honorarium for my appearance. According to the Department of Justice current legal theory, I could have been prosecuted under FARA for engaging in political speech at the direction of a foreign government. But my only, quote, crime, unquote, would have been speaking truth to power, which, as the Supreme Court has repeatedly declared, is no crime at all. It is an American right, says Scott. An American obligation, says Scott. Protected by the First Amendment, says Scott. Today, I continue to speak out against bad U.S. foreign policy. The opinions I express are mine and mine alone, derived from a lifetime experience and study, bolstered by conversations and observations made during my interactions with the Russians, both civilian and government alike. And according to the New York Times, the Department of Justice is apparently seeking to criminalize my ability to freely express these opinions. Now, I have to note here, this is not just the Department of Justice. This is the Democratic Department of Justice, the head of which has been appointed by a Democratic president. There have been no objections from the Democratic Party as a party, supposedly the mainstay of democracy, to this kind of treatment of free speech by the Department of Justice. I point out here that the Democratic Party is supposed to be the defender of civil liberties, the primary defender of civil liberties, the primary defenders of free speech and free press. But now, today, the only thing that the Department of Justice and the other departments of government are evidently prepared to defend is their own narratives about what is happening, in the world. They don't at all defend the right of the people to hear alternative opinions, to read alternative opinions, and to make their own judgments about them. In other words, they don't defend the democracy in the United States. I know. There isn't any longer a democracy in the United States. That we want to see one, we believe it should be one, and therefore we believe the government has an obligation to defend the civil liberties of the citizens of the United States. And the Department of Justice is not honoring this obligation. The government is not honoring this obligation, and the Democratic Party is not honoring this obligation. They are trying to impose a kind of totalitarianism of speech and press upon us all. Going on with the article. The ODNI threat assessment is particularly worrisome insofar as it not only targets, quote, personalities, unquote, such as myself, but also the platforms I use to publish the content I produce, whether it be in the form of articles, videos, or live stream discussions. The threat, as articulated by the ODNI, comes in the form of the Russian government's alleged infiltration of these platforms to promote a pro-Russian narrative. During their questioning of my wife on August 7th, the FBI pointedly asked about my podcast, asked the inspector, and how my co-host and partner Jeff Norman paid me. I was asked similar questions. The clear implication asking these questions is that the Department of Justice is concerned that the platforms I used to publish my material, my Substack, my podcasts, my X and Telegram accounts, and part and parcel of a Kremlin disinformation campaign designed to interfere in the 2024 U.S. elections. Scott says, this argument is facially ludicrous. The Ask the Inspector podcast was the byproduct of a brainstorming session between Jeff Norman and myself on how we could capitalize on the popularity of my appearances on other podcasts had generated. The feeling was that we could collaborate to produce quality content that might be able to generate some income. The Russian government had nothing whatsoever to do with our decision to create Ask the Inspector, or to create a Substack, or I would publish content we could then discuss on our podcast. There is no doubt that the topic and concept of Russia served as the heart of the podcast early on. The title, Ask the Inspector, was a play on my experience as a weapons inspector in both Iraq and the former Soviet Union. Indeed, promoting my book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, was one of the initial priorities of the podcasts. But the heart and soul of Ask the Inspector is the interaction the quote, inspector, quote, unquote, have with the audience who submit questions ahead of time in writing, leave a voice message, call in live, or leave a live text in the podcast chat. This interaction is unique among podcasts of this nature and gives the show a unique, quote, feel, unquote, that has become its signature characteristic. On occasion, Jeff and I, ably assisted by our producers, Elena and Ryan, conduct interviews with knowledgeable guests before turning the show back over to the audience for their questions. In the past, these interviews include persons like former Congressman and current congressional candidate Denis Kucinich. Yes, we talk politics. And Russian war correspondent, I guess it's Marat Kerulin. Yes, we talked about the Russian-Ukraine conflict. I'd like to believe that between the quality of the guest, the attention to detail that goes into the questioning, and the quality of the answers, any Ask the Inspector that includes such interviews is a standalone piece of journalism. He says he'd like to believe that. I affirm, having watched those particular treatments, that they were indeed standalone pieces of journalism, in my opinion. I expand on the work I've done on Ask the Inspector through my collaboration with Soloviev Live, a Russian media platform owned and operated by Vladimir Soloviev, a well-known Russian media personality. Through my collaboration with Peter Ermelin, a producer with Soloviev Live, I've interviewed dozens of significant Russian experts, academics, politicians, journalists, and military specialists to better understand the Russian perspective on issues of importance. My collaboration is 100% pro bono. I receive no money or other material incentive for doing this work. My goal is simply to empower my audience with knowledge and information they're not able to access elsewhere in the West, where Russian voices are actively suppressed. While Peter and I collaborate on guest selection, the questions asked and interview priorities are solely my responsibility. The resulting product produced by Soloviev Live is broadcast under the title Scott Ritter Show in Russia to a Russian audience, and on my website and social media channels to a Western English-speaking audience. Scott Ritter Show is what, in my opinion, journalism should be all about, seeking out the fact-based truth and providing broader, sometimes alternative perspectives to the complex problem that the world faces today. I post other video content on my Substack, what used to be called the, quote, 2-minute topics, unquote, are the byproduct of a collaboration with RT where I provide a video clip of me speaking into a camera and RT providing graphic enhancements. I alone decide the content of these videos, which tend to focus on world events. I am compensated for this work by RT. Sputnik turns videos I do into finished products as well, which they then publish on social media. I repost these videos to increase their viewership, not because I'm paid. I'm not, but because I support the message being transmitted, because I am the source of that message. also produce original video content designed to reach both American and Russian audiences. In these, I am the one who conceives the content, authors the script, and provides the desired image to be used to make the video. I also am the one who compensates those video editors who assist in the production of the video. I've also collaborated with a private video production team to produce a two-part documentary, Agent Zelensky, where I helped write the script and served as the on-air presenter for the film. I was otherwise compensated for my work on this project. I was likewise compensated for my work on this project. Hundreds of thousands of people viewed this documentary before YouTube deplatformed it. Why do you suppose YouTube deplatformed it? This is my commentary. Was there any hand of the government, of the U.S. government, in their deplatforming of this documentary? Did the government request that it be deplatformed? I, as a citizen of the United States, would like to know whether the government violated the First Amendment through use of that kind of influence. I've produced controversial documentary content before. My film, In Shifting Sands, was lambasted as Iraqi propaganda when it first came out in 2001. It has more than withstood the test of time in terms of its accuracy and integrity of its message. I am confident that Agent Zelensky will as well. But my greatest impact, I believe, comes from my writing. My Substack publishes original content that I alone am responsible for in terms of its content. I often touch upon issues pertaining to Russia, which are critical of U.S. policy positions, because Russia is likewise critical of U.S. policy positions. There is often significant agreement between the positions that I independently take and the positions taken by the Russian government. This alignment of ideas does not constitute either direction or control, but rather a shared point of view independently arrived at. Because, of course, we all know, folks, correlation is not causation. Just because there's an alignment of ideas between what Scott says and what the Russian government says from time to time doesn't mean that Scott's views were caused by the Russian government. The same can be said of articles I publish in Consortium News, or articles I previously published in Truthdig, the American conservative, in the Washington Spectator, before I was deplatformed for writing for RT. I also published extensively at Energy Intelligence, where the topics covered often deal with Russia. Because of my extensive interactions with Russians, including Russian state-controlled media, the content that I produce and publish, which draws upon this connectivity, possesses a strong Russian character. This, of course, is my intent, since one of my goals and objectives in doing what I do is to further better understanding between the Russian and American people by overcoming systemic Russophobia in the United States through exposure to what I call the, quote, Russian reality, unquote. Here I have to emphasize, and this is me, Joe Firestone again, there is systemic Russophobia here in the United States, and that damages our foreign policy and has currently brought us to the brink of war with Russia in Ukraine. Indeed, the Russians are beginning to think that we are at war with them, in Ukraine, or at least that NATO is at war with them now, especially in the Kursk invasion that we just have seen. This Russophobia is hugely damaging to U.S. foreign policy, and it must stop, in my view. This is Joe Firestone talking. Going back to the article, one way I seek to define the, quote, Russian reality, unquote, is to bring Russian voices to the attention of an American audience for the purpose of providing a Russian perspective on issues that pertain to Russia. Quote, knowledge is power, unquote, is one of my principal themes and exposing people to the Russian perspective so they might be more able to discern for themselves how they feel about a given issue and what actions they may wish to undertake as a result is the very definition of empowerment. The author speaking to an audience in Russia, this picture is in 2023. The Department of Justice believes my writing is done at the behest of the Russian government. This is ludicrous in the extreme. The positions I have taken in opposition to U.S. government policy regarding Russia significantly predate my interaction with Russia and Russians. I've authored 11 books since my first effort, Endgame, Solving the Iraq Problem Once and for All, was published in 1999 by Simon & Schuster. My book, which is about America's addiction to nuclear weapons, Scorpion King, was published by Clarity Press in June of 2020. It was an updated and expanded version of 2010 edition, published by Nation Books under the title Dangerous Ground. My point in highlighting these volumes is simply to point out that I have been speaking out and writing about the dangers of nuclear weapons and American nuclear policy for some time, a full decade before I entered any relationship with RT. I have been writing about arms control for decades as well, including the aforementioned Endgame, as well as a memoir of my time as a UN weapons inspector in Iraq, Iraq Confidential, and 2 volumes about the Iranian nuclear program, Target Iran, published by Nation Books in 2006, and Deal Breaker, published by Clarity Press in 2018. Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika was published in 2022. I've been doing arms control and disarmament for a long time as well. I've published 2 volumes on the concept of holding elected officials accountable for what they do in our name, Frontier Justice, published in 2003 by Context Books, and Waging Peace, The Art of War for the Anti-War Movement, published by Nation Books in 2007. Being politically engaged as a citizen activist has been part of my DNA for decades. Writing about this graphic, of course, is about the book that Scott has published with Anya Kay, based on interviews he has had with her. I'm sure he mentions this, in the text of the article. Coming up. Writing about failed military adventures has likewise been part of my literary repertoire. 2010, I co-authored a book, War in Iraq, with William Rivers Pitt. The late, and lamented, by the way, William Rivers Pitt, who tragically died at a very young age a few years ago, which was published by Context Books and spoke to the dangers of going to war with Iraq based on a lie. Just this year, Clarity Press published a book I co-authored with Anya Kay, a Polish podcaster, called Covering Ukraine, the Scott Ritter interviews through the eyes of Anya Kay. The Department of Justice would have you believe that Covering Ukraine, which takes a critical look at the Ukraine conflict in a way that is more sympathetic to the Russian narrative than that being promulgated in the U.S., is part and parcel of a Russian disinformation campaign that uses me in my work, quote, wittingly or unwittingly, unquote, to sow disinformation designed to move the needle of the American body politic in 2024 election. Scott says, they are half right. I am trying to move the needle of the American body politic this election season away from the failed and failing policies of the Biden administration and toward a policy direction that avoids conflict while promoting peace. But I don't do this as an agent, witting or unwitting, of the Russian government. I do this as a loyal American patriot who's been engaged in the business of informing and educating an American audience for decades, always with the goal of guiding my fellow citizens away from bad policy and toward better policy. There is no greater patriotic calling, and of course I agree with Scott about this completely. The Supreme Court has stated unequivocally that, quote, our First Amendment decisions have created a rough hierarchy in the constitutional protection of speech. Core political speech occupies the highest, most protected position, unquote, adding that, quote, expressions on public issues has always rested on the highest rung of the hierarchy of First Amendment values, unquote. Likewise, the Supreme Court has held that for the Department of Justice to prosecute speech it deems offensive would directly contradict the First Amendment's core ability to prevent the government from suppressing, quote, unpopular ideas or information, unquote. Expressing dissatisfaction with the policies of the United States is, according to the Supreme Court, quote, expression situated at the core of our First Amendment values, unquote. The Supreme Court has further elaborated on this point, declaring that, quote, there is practically universal agreement that a major purpose of the First Amendment was to protect the free discussion of governmental affairs, unquote. One of my greatest concerns is that the American people remain indifferent to the attack on their basic freedoms and liberties the Department of Justice raids on myself and Dimitri Simes represent, carved into a wall as the final words one confronts as they leave the United States Holocaust the museum, is the post-war confessional poem written by the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller. These words are meant to serve as an indictment of the passivity and indifference shown by Niemöller and his fellow German as the Holocaust raged all around them. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. First, they came for Julian Assange, and I did not speak out because he was not an American. This is Scott now. And they came for RT and Sputnik, and I did not speak out because they were Russian. Then they came for Scott Ritter, and I did not speak out because I disagreed with his point of view. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I offer this stream in line with the sentiment that Scott just expressed in this quote. We can also speak of the ongoing prosecution of the Uhura 3, members of an American Pan-Africanist movement charged with acting as agents of the Russian government in this regard. No one will be left to speak up in our collective defense of free speech, because free speech and a free press were allowed to be killed by a politicized Department of Justice working at the behest of a U.S. government which retained its hold on power by suppressing all opposition in the name of defending democracy from misinformation and disinformation. Despite the reality that the U.S. government and its minions in the mainstream media collude daily to control the narrative of all issues which give rise to public concern and criticism, here's the unvarnished truth. If you allow yourself to sit back passively while the U.S. government attacks free speech and a free press in the name of countering Russian disinformation, you are remaining passive in the death of America and all it stands for. Because once the U.S. government silences the, quote, pro-Russian, unquote, crowd, they will turn their sights on the next practitioner of inconvenient speech. If you are a pro-gun advocate, you're next, and no one will be there to defend you. If you are pro-life, you're next, and no one will be there to defend you. If you are anti-vaccination, you're next, and no one will be there to defend you. There is a saying, once a Marine, always a Marine. Specifically, Marines are defined and motivated by those who have gone before them. One of the Marines that I have used as my historical mentor is Captain Bill Barber. From November 28th to December 2nd, 1950, Captain Barber and the Marines of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, defended a 3-mile stretch of hills known as the Toktung Pass. This, of course, was in Korea. For 5 days and 6 nights, Barbers and the Marines of Fox Company, some 220 strong, held off an attacking force of 1,800 Chinese. At the end of the battle, more than 1,000 Chinese lay dead on the hilly ground around Toktung Pass. Only 82 of Barber's Marines were able to walk off the hills. Barber was ordered to withdraw after the first night because his commanders believed his company could not hold out. Had he obeyed that order, 8,000 Marines would have been trapped in the mountains of North Korea, cut off from their escape route. Because Barber refused to retreat, these 8,000 Marines were able to be evacuated. Free speech is my Toktung Pass, says Scott. If you want to support my work, go to scottritter.com, where you can subscribe to my Substack, buy autographed copies of my books, and purchase merchandise related to my work. The Department of Justice's investigations will likely lead to a costly defense of my free speech rights. We're in the process of establishing a fund for such legal expenses. Okay, so that's it for Scott's defense of free speech. I hope you'll agree it was a magnificent defense of free speech, and I hope that you have tolerated my comments in defense of what Scott Ritter had to say. I think on the issue of free speech, he is entirely right. Okay, my time is almost gone here, but I do intend to hit a second piece, which I felt was very important, that Scott also did. And that speech I guess I'm not sharing that quite yet. Okay, I'm sharing it now. This was done on August 21st, 2024. It's from Scott Ritter Extra. And it says, the headline is Scott Ritter remembers Phil Donahue, a heartfelt tribute to the legendary TV hosts. There's a picture of Phil Donahue, December 1st, 1935 to August 18th, 2024. He was 88 when he died. I got to know Phil in 2010 when he returned to the television talk show circuit on MSNBC as the host of Donahue. Scott goes on, America was at that time collectively beating the drums of war, with the Bush administration making the case that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed a threat to world peace sufficient enough to justify a military invasion. Phil, however, thought it was important to ask questions before signing on to the government case for war. He asked his producer, Jeff Cohn, to find a voice in opposition to the war. Jeff called me and asked if I would be the guest on Phil's premiere. I accepted. Donahue premiered on July 12, 2002. More than 1 million people tuned in, making it the top-rated show in America in prime time. Okay, as Eric Bollert wrote in Salon magazine, quote, it was telling that Donahue's first guest on the inaugural show was Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector turned dove, who argued, the United States today has no basis to declare war on Iraq. An ex-Marine and a proud Republican who spent years in inspecting Saddam Hussein's arsenal, Ritter has been surprisingly absent from the national debate about a new war with Iraq. Donahue fixed that oversight in one night. According to Jeff Cohn, the decision to bring me on created a storm of controversy within MSNBC. He wrote about the difficulties in booking voices opposed to the war. Quote, not every weapons expert had been wrong, unquote, Cohn noted. Quote, take ex-Marine and former UN Inspector Scott Ritter. In last months of 2002, he told any audience or journalist who would hear him that Iraqi WMD represented no threat to our country. Quote, send in the inspectors, unquote, urged Ritter. Quote, don't send in the Marines, unquote. It's telling that in the run-up to the war, no American TV network, this is a quote, hired any on-air analysts from among the experts who questioned White House WMD claims. None would hire Ritter. Quote, inside MSNBC in 2002, Ritter was the target of a smear that he was receiving covert funds from Saddam Hussein's government. The baseless slur was obviously aimed at reducing his media appearances. It surfaced like clockwork at MSNBC, and we sought to book Ritter as a guest on Donahue. The famous American journalist and political commentator Bill Moyers asked Donahue about this in 2007. Bill Moyers, you had Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, who was saying that if we invade, it will be a historic blunder. Phil Donahue said, you didn't have him alone. He had to be there with someone else who supported the war. In other words, you couldn't have Scott Ritter alone. You could have Richard Kerr alone, Bill Moyers, but you could have the conservative, Phil Donahue. You could have the supporters of the president alone. And they would say why this war is important. You couldn't have a dissenter alone. Our producers were instructed to feature two conservatives for any liberal. Bill Moyers said, you're kidding. Phil Donahue said, no, this is absolutely true. On February 25, 2023, MSNBC canceled Donahue, its top-rated show. An internal NBC report described host Phil Donahue as, quote, difficult public face for NBC in a time of war, unquote, noting that senior management worried that Donahue's show would become, quote, a home for the liberal anti-war agenda at the same time that our competitors are waving the flag at every opportunity, unquote. So much for free speech, so much for the dedication of MSNBC to free speech. It's never been dedicated to free speech. It's always been dedicated to getting views at the expense of its competitors. It's about profits over people. That's my view. That's not what Scott wrote. The straw that broke the camel's back was my last appearance on Donahue on January 15, 2003. I appeared side by side with Richard Butler, my former boss at the United Nations. This transcript speaks for itself. Donahue, Mr. Ritter, a comment on the final point that he made briefly, please. Ritter, what I'll say is this. I take strong agreement with contention that you know that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Butler, oh, come on, Scott, that's on the public record. Ritter, of course it's not. The public record actually says, with all due respect. Butler, you signed the papers to me when you worked for me, advising me with all of your intellect and knowledge. You signed pieces of paper to me saying that Iraq has hidden weapons of mass destruction. Ritter, never. I signed pieces of paper to you that said we have credible intelligence information that says Iraq has it. And I asked your permission to carry out an inspection. But understand it's an investigation. You just made a definitive statement that says you know Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. But with all due respect, Richard, that is never reflected in any of the documents, even the one you just mentioned. Butler, that's not true. Ritter, it is true. I have it here tonight. Do you want to go through the document page by page and show the people? So Donahue said, well, probably not. There was laughter. Butler said, it's absolutely established that Iraq is not accounted for. And Ritter said, bingo, I agree with that, has not accounted for. But that's an accounting issue. Butler, so where are the 500 shells with mustard in them? Where's the 400 tons? Ritter, these are good questions, but do you have evidence they have it? Butler, where are the missiles? Ritter, do you know they have it for a fact that they possess it as we speak? Or is the problem that Iraq has provided an accounting that we don't have evidence to back it up, that we can't confirm the Iraqi version of this position? My point is, why are you assuming such a degree of innocence on the part of the Iraqis? Quote, because 200,000 Americans are going to war based upon a perception of a threat. You testified before the U.S. Senate that Iraq has these weapons, and people listened to you and they gave that credibility when the fact is you do not know with absolute certainty that Iraq has these weapons. Scott, the United States applause. And Ritter, I'm not going to stand by and let Americans die in combat because people like you mislead the American Congress. I just won't allow that to happen. Butler, oh, for God's sake, I mislead the American Congress? Question mark. Ritter, you said you know where the weapons are. Where are they? Butler, please allow me to finish. There is on the record at the United Nations pieces of paper signed by you. Ritter says, I have them here, addressed to me saying, these people have concealed weapons. Please authorize me to go find them. And you signed those documents. Sometimes I did, and sometimes I told you no. Give me an example when I said no. I told you no because I thought what you're doing was excessive. Give me an example, Richard. Come on. No, please, in front of the people here tonight. You said this many times. You've brought my credibility into question. I can document every time we've met, every time I briefed you, and every time you sign it. Please, for the benefit of the public tonight, one example of when you turned me down. Phil Donahue cut off the debate at that point. It should be noted that documents I refer to were part of the archive seized by the FBI when they raided my home on August the 7th. I last saw Phil Donahue at the Fighting Bob Festival in Wisconsin in 2008. Who was Fighting Bob? Fighting Bob was a notable progressive congressman who represented Wisconsin, and I think later a senator, if I recall correctly. Fighting Bob La Follette. He was Fighting Bob during the 1910s and 1920s. And then he had a Bob Jr., who also became a congressman and perhaps a senator, who went on in his tradition during the 1930s and 1940s. But going on with the article. He was in good spirits, that is Phil Donahue was, and we reminisced about the time we tried to stop the war in Iraq, which was at that time still raging. We had both been proven right in our opposition to this war. Those who promoted the war continued to draw large salaries in their jobs at NBC and MSNBC, while Phil and I spoke to local crowds in Chautauqua. Looking back, Phil and I got the better of the deal. We retained our honor and integrity. Phil died this past Sunday, and with his passing went one of the last honest journalists in America. Except perhaps in the alternative press, Scott. I think a lot of us are still here in the alternative press, and a lot of us still do not lie. We do not lie. We tell the truth as we see it. So, let me go on with your comments. And Robert Copeland says he is biased in support of Russia. Oh, I see. Steve Ulrich says, hello, everybody. Lana says, happy Thursday shared. Lana Dell, that is. And Robert says, Joe Firestone is discussing about a person I have no respect for in Scott Ritter. And Steve says, Robert, why? And D, Around the World with Being Friends, says, hello, everyone, shared. And Steve says, hi, D. I'll be joining D in a few minutes, by the way. Robert Copeland says he's biased in support of Russia in the Russia versus Ukraine war. Steve says, smashed. Okay, the like button. Robert, I certainly disagree with you there. I don't think he's biased in favor, of Russian. I think he's telling the truth, as he sees it. And I think he tries to be objective. No doubt he's favorable to Russian, but I think that he knows he's favorable to Russian, and he thinks that his favorability to Russian is merited by the facts on the table. If he were talking with you, he would say that you are biased against Russia. Steve Wolfman says, Robert, he was saying for over a year Ukraine is running out of soldiers, but it never seems to happen. Well, the estimates are right now that the Ukraine, which had 600,000 soldiers to begin with, now has 300,000 soldiers left, whereas Russia, which had 90,000 soldiers to begin with, now has 700,000 soldiers in Ukraine and another 400,000 soldiers who've not been committed to Ukraine yet. So, yes, I would say Ukraine is running out of soldiers, Steve. It is running out of soldiers, especially the good ones, because it has 300,000 soldiers yet, because it added 300,000 to the original 600,000, which, by the way, there's evidence it has lost, that it has had 600,000 fatalities among the soldiers. Lana Dell says, please hit the like button. Lana says, John Mearsheimer also believes that Ukraine will ultimately lose the war. Yes, and he believes that Ukraine is currently losing the war, as does Colonel McGregor, as does Jeffrey Sachs, as does almost every responsible commentator on this war. Silencing of Ritter should not be applauded, in my opinion, any more than Julian Assange, regardless of whether we agree with either or like their stance. Robert says, I believe Ukraine may lose the war, but Russia will be a weaker country after the war they were before the war started. Robert, after the war ends, it is projected by all observing this that Russia is going to have a military of 1.5 million soldiers after the war. Twice as many soldiers as it had at the beginning of the war, maybe more than twice as many. It will have doubled its military. It has greatly increased its manufacturing capacity for war all through this particular war. And its economy is stronger now than it was at the beginning of the war. How can you say that Russia will be a weaker country? It has much more in the area of hypersonic missiles than it had at the beginning of the war. And they're faster now. Robert says, I don't know when the war will be over, as it may happen next week or 2 years from now. It's likely to be much closer to next week than 2 years from now. Steve says, I think Russia is stronger now in many ways. I'd like to know where Scott Ritter is getting his information, and is the information the truth? Where he's getting his information is he has lots of sources both in and out of Russia and among militaries of various kinds. And Scott's evaluations are very similar to Colonel McGregor's evaluations. And his evaluations are also coming from many sources inside of Europe, sources inside the United States, inside our military, and sources in Eastern Europe. And he comes to very similar evaluations to Scott. Steve, how many airplanes, ships, tanks, and soldiers and other weapons has Russia lost in the war? I cannot give you, an estimate of that, but Scott can. I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to give you that estimate. Well, maybe I am. Scott's estimate is that Russia has lost something like I heard, but the last time I heard this, it was a few months ago, so it certainly changed, okay, by now. But his estimates at that time was that Russia had 60,000 deaths to Ukraine's 500,000 deaths. Now the estimates for Ukraine fatalities are up to 600,000. I'm sure Russian fatalities have grown as well. But the ratio of fatalities is 8 or 9 or 10 to 1 in Russia's favor. And Steve rightly says, Robert, many, but they keep on manufacturing. And they have more equipment now, more airplanes, certainly more tanks. I don't know about the ships, and more soldiers than they had, okay, at the beginning of the war. Far more than they had, okay, at the beginning of the war. Because the 700,000 of their troops that are in the Ukraine theater are all very, very well armed. Robert says, I don't like Scott Ritter. He has the right to speak about his content, but people choose to listen or not listen to his content. I certainly agree, but I think the government has no right to try to prevent him from presenting his content, which obviously is what they've been doing. Lana says, that must have been a second Donahue show. I used to watch him in the mid-'80s. Yes, it was a second show. It started in 2002 and continued to 2003 when he was taken off the air by MSNBC for the reasons stated in the article. Londell says, Bill Morris is a good man too. I know he retired. Lana says, Walter Cronkite is dead. He is. Was. Joe, then Russia should have already won the power if they have a huge manpower advantage. Not so, because because even if they have a huge manpower advantage of 7-3, they are also the attackers, and Ukraine is primarily in a defensive mode right now. I would agree with you that Russia should have already won the war if they had a 3 or a 4-1 manpower advantage, but they don't have that quite yet. But that is coming. Where Russia is at this point is they're on the point of driving the Ukrainians out of the Donbass. They will also shortly close the salient, in Kursk, I'm sure within a month. Many people have currently testified to the idea that they believe that the military in Ukraine is on the point of collapse. I believe this is true. I think a collapse could be imminent. I think the overthrow of Zelensky is probably imminent. Once it occurs, I think things will quickly collapse, and Ukraine at that point will sue for peace. I don't know whether Russia will accept their overtures for peace. I think it depends on who takes over and whether the person who takes over is willing to recognize all the Russian gains, that they have made, in the war. Robert says, Russia's lost a lot of military weapons in this war, which will need to be replaced. Robert, they've already been replaced. They've already been replaced, and the Russian force has grown and is fully armed and is not short of tanks. They have a surfeit, of missiles. They have a surfeit, of planes. The F-16s have begun to arrive, in Ukraine. The Russians have begun to attack them. They've already destroyed their first one, and other destructions of F-16 planes are coming because the Russians have better planes to use there than the F-16s and in greater quantity. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night, everybody. Yeah, good night, Steve, and good night, everybody. I am going over to D's show right now. I hope you'll follow me to give a boost, to D. Thank you very much for coming. This was another well-attended stream. I'm very pleased, okay, with that. Thank you, Robert, for your comments. Thank you, Steve, for your comments. Thank you, Lana, for your comments, okay, as well. So good night. I will be back on Saturday. Saturday, I'll be back with a domestic politics show, I believe, unless something very critical happens with respect to the international system, between now, okay, and then. So I'm ending the stream here, and thank you all very much.